So Parliament will only debate the Phala Phala Farm report next Tuesday. The National Assembly's Programming Committee has agreed with political party whips to move that meeting to the Cape Town City Hall. That's in order to accommodate members of Parliament to attend physically. Joining us now to talk about the latest developments is Sanusha Naidu, a political analyst. Sanusha, welcome back to the program. So you were also among the very first people to react to this situation. How would you rate Parliament's handling of where things stand at the moment?
Good afternoon, Tembekile, and to the viewers. I think it's been a very difficult period as well. I mean, Parliament is supposed to be that body that is independent in terms of the separation of powers. So this independent panel of inquiry that has produced the report, which then has been the contestation that we see now in our body politic of the state. I mean, everybody seems to have, it's a polarizing issue right now in the context of where we are. So Parliament also, in the way that they've been looking at this, and the constant reminder that Parliament is part of the legislative body of the state and supposed to basically act as the checks and balances and the oversight. So obviously its role and its independence has to be maintained. But I think given the situation where we find ourselves in the context of also having just come out of a marathon several days following the release of the report and the recommendation, you can see that there's also the question around how does Parliament position itself in terms of process, procedure and way forward. Remember that Parliament has to maintain that level of independence, but then of course there's been these challenges that Parliament has experienced in the past in whether or not it can become that independent kind of oversight body that plays that checks and balances role and keeps the executive accountable. And in this case, even more of a complexity because it has to deal with the report that says that the president of the country has a case to answer for in the context of what has happened with regard to the Phala Phala scandal and the question of foreign currency.
But we now know that the president has officially filed papers with the Constitutional Court seeking that review, basically saying that primarily the panel misunderstood its mandate and basically relied on evidence that cannot be, quote-unquote, this wasn't his word, trusted to reach a credible conclusion as far as him being in a compromised position, shall we say, in his handling of the theft at his farm. Give me your sense of the strength of the president's legal arguments in challenging this report.
Well, I'm not a legal expert, so let me just preface my comments by saying that mine is more of reading the documents that were lodged and the application that was made yesterday. So obviously what the president is seeking is he's seeking the Constitutional Court to deliberate under in what he cites as part of the Constitution, Section 167. 4E, where he says that in terms of how you put it, that there is a sense that they may have erred, or they've erred in the way that they have interpreted their mandate. Now, obviously, this is going to be quite an important deliberation by the Constitutional Court in terms of what legal experts are saying in the context that we've never been here before, Tembekile. We've never had this tested in a court of law yet, because this ruling or this recommendation, not ruling, this recommendation of the panel is something that stems out of what was transpiring in the previous administration of the country in terms of how do we deal with the impeachment process and what happens in the context of Parliament. So given the ruling that the Constitutional Court made in terms of how do you go forward, I think here is where it's going to be a litmus test for both whether the president can get Parliament or take, I think it is the fourth respondent in his papers, which is the Speaker of the National Assembly, and say that they also need, in terms of the rule 129, and he gives subsections to that rule, that they also need to look at Parliament. Now we're straying into very, very uncharted territory here in terms of separation of powers, and do we have to then see what the Constitutional Court justices say? Firstly, in the application that has been placed, does it go through the lower court in terms of process procedure from lower court to the next court, and then of course comes finally to the Constitutional Court? One of the things that I interpret, when I read it about what the papers are saying, what the president is saying, is that he wants it to be expedited. And I think that's something that, again, if the process is drawn out in terms of where this actually places him.
Right.
But of course, the the impression here one gets as well is, does this then stray into how the separation of powers can be compromised? So you talked about a compromised president, but it also then tests the separation of powers. And the question is, does the Constitutional Court like these kinds of things? So there's the other question as well. I think one of the legal experts that were on your program or on the station previously was talking about, when will they give this kind of exceptional circumstances to take a direct application from the president, given the legal ambit in terms of that. So there's quite a few questions here, but I think in terms of the separation of powers, for me personally, I think that's something that's going to be a test in the context of where we are.
So the ANC's national executive has basically instructed its members in parliament, the caucus, to vote as a bloc to basically prevent the adoption of this report. There are rumours, murmurs, reports that some, in fact, intend to defy the party position. But realistically, what are the chances of that happening when you look at the ANC's track record when it comes to voting against its own, even when this is not a figure or a figure who's loved by all in the organisation, even in or on the parliamentary benches?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a messy affair. I mean, to think about the fact that when you listen to the press briefing yesterday following the whole debacle of the days of the hours immediately after the report was released, and then of course the uncertainty of why there is so much of inconsistency and lack of communication and lack of coherence in terms of how everything's supposed to follow process and procedure in the party. And then of course you kind of saw these media reports coming out that they're going to close ranks around, so they're going to basically instruct members to follow a particular suit. And there was something very interesting that the TG said in the press briefing yesterday. If when he was making his announcing the press briefing and what the outcome of the meeting was, of the special NEC meeting yesterday, he said something which caught my attention, and that is, if the debate happens today, or as he said it yesterday, if it happens tomorrow in Parliament. So obviously there's a sense here of that in itself also kind of underpinning this. Whether or not they are able to close ranks, I mean, the murmurs, etc., that we're hearing has been very unpredictable in terms of where this is going. Starting off with the president and the kind of sense that he was going to resign, then he wasn't going to resign, then he was taking it under consultation, then he was, being told that he needs to fight, and so forth. So all of this kind of comes together in the sense of also members in Parliament. How do they feel? Do they feel that if they are strong enough, bold enough to think they're going to go against the party, but then what does this mean for them, life after the party? Or do they get wrapped over the knuckles? Do they get kicked off restructured in terms of committees, taken off, bumped off lists? I mean, all of this hinges on a lot of issues that talk to the lives and livelihoods of members in the ANC. They lost a lot of councils in the 2021 local government election. So we're seeing challenges here again around vested interest. And
the challenge will be for the opposition, won't it, Sanusha, if it's hoping that there will be those who basically stage a revolt and vote against the party line, is that when you look at the stats, the ANC holds about 60% almost of representation, that's seats in Parliament. They would need a substantial chunk of members of the ANC to vote with them. And even with that in mind, not all opposition parties intend to vote the same way even.
Yeah, I mean, the challenge here, I mean, apart from the fact that we're talking about an ANC that has instructed its members to behave in a certain way when it comes to the debate, the report, and what would be the vote. And of course, we know that the national speaker the Speaker of the National Assembly has essentially decided that there won't be any secret ballot, etc. And then, of course, the question of manually recording. I mean, that's another question as well that the DA brought as a request, which was also turned down. So what we're beginning to see here is whether the opposition parties are sufficiently and can strategically sway members of the ANC, members of Parliament that belong to the ANC, onto their card, onto their wicket, so to speak. And so can they move them and move that space and say, well, what would it take for us to sway you in this way? And I'm not sure if what we are seeing now and how the cards are stacked and how they are falling, how people are looking, how members of parliament are looking. I mean, if it's genuinely, I think it was one of the chief whips today that was interviewed that said if you're genuinely concerned about this democracy, you would not be influenced by all of this other stuff in terms of how does this play out in terms of party over state.
Do you think realistically though that the ANC, things would have been easier for the party to dump, quote-unquote, Ramaphosa if he wasn't going into the conference, the upcoming conference next week with such strong numbers? For example, the man touted as his main challenger has about half of the branch support that Ramaphosa is holding going to Nasrec.
I mean, there's a lot of gamble here, Tembekile. I mean, there's gamble that obviously process procedure is important. I mean, in terms of where BGMs are, it took a long while before these BGMs could actually finally have their meetings and basically nominate their candidates for the positions in the top 6. And this had to do with a number of issues, whether it was the scanning codes that weren't working, ESCOM challenges, people that weren't actually working after hours in the Lutuli House to manually upload the register of people that were at these BGMs. So all of this is kind of there. But I think if you take all of that away and you ask the question again is, we come back to this issue of whether it's about Ramaphosa or whether it is about how do we actually keep our interests intact in the party. Mm-hmm. Because Ramaphosa kind of provides us that kind of very, very, if you want to call it, that ground cover in a sense. So I think the challenge right now is whether or not it's about him or whether it's about, well, here's a problem we have because we don't have a succession in plan. We don't actually have somebody who's going to take over. And we know that, as one of the journalists said, I think it was on the Sunday program in a debate, where they said, well, in terms of the best, Ramaphosa is basically the best of the worst in this pool.
Sanusha Naidu, good to speak to you. Thank you.